Hi, I want to discuss barriers to communication in organizations, in our personal life. What actually inhibits, what creates roadblocks, what actually creates barriers to communication? That's going to be the topic for today. Moving on to an introduction to communication barriers. How do we define communication barriers? Anything that obstructs, distorts, slows down, blocks communication is called a barrier to communication. It's important we understand communication has these kind of challenges that we need to navigate. We got to understand the different types of barriers and how do we overcome these barriers? What are the strategies that we can have at the workplace? What are the strategies we can have at the personal level? And what are the strategies that we can have at an intergroup team level to overcome these barriers? So, what are the basic categories of barriers? There can be physical barriers, there can be psychological barriers to communication, language barriers or linguistic barriers, barriers that are caused by the cultural differences. Each of us come from a different culture. And obviously, that can be a barrier when we talk to people, when we interact with colleagues, that can be barriers. And of course, organizational barriers. Large organizations have strong hierarchical structures, several departments at several international locations, creating a lot of organizational barriers that also can be technology related barriers as well. So, moving on, we'll discuss the different types of barriers, categories of barriers, and under each category, we'll also discuss how do we overcome these barriers. So, the first category of barriers is physical barriers, which includes environmental barriers or factors that can be actual physical noise, also distance when you're far away, when there's that kind of distance between two people communicating, maybe you don't get to hear them properly, and poor equipment. So bad phone connection, poor signals, bad internet connectivity. These all can be physical barriers to communication. Time zone. I've had a chance to work in several countries for a global university. And this global university had campuses in New York, headquartered in New York, had campuses in Jordan, where I worked. I also worked at their UAE based campus. And they had campuses in Nanjing and also in Vancouver and a couple of campuses in New York. So they had campuses all across the globe. So communicating with my dean, communicating with colleagues elsewhere is a clear example of time zone differences that can become a barrier. You cannot assume that everybody's going to be awake 24/7 and you can speak to anybody out there. So time zone differences can cause barriers. Workplace layout, remote communication. I know what we are doing right now is that we are trying to create material for you towards understanding communication barriers. We don't get to see students face to face in all classes. That can sometimes create challenges. And of course, we have technology solutions towards mitigating these kind of barriers. Improve technology, discussion boards, emails, stuff like Blackboard or Canvas, the learning management systems that we have in place can always help mitigate these barriers in an educational setting. And improve technologies can like Google Meet, Teams, Zoom, other technologies that we use like Microsoft Hub can all mitigate these kind of barriers in an organizational setting so that we can transact business, we can discuss important stuff and get work done. Moving on, we also deal with a lot of psychological barriers, personal biases, stuff that I've learned as a child, and the kind of influences that I've had from people around me, teachers, my family. It must have changed my perception. My emotional state today can be a barrier sometimes. Stress levels, if you had too much work to do the prior week, it can create, communication issues, anxiety. You're waiting for something to happen. It's been frustrating as you wait for something to get done. That kind of anxiety can create a psychological barrier. People with a ton of experience sometimes suffer from overconfidence as a psychological barrier. They assume that everybody is of their level and they don't empathize enough. So, overconfidence can impact how a message is being delivered by, say, someone in the top leadership. That can become a psychological barrier. Most often, we do not have enough empathy towards others. That is where we lack emotional intelligence. If we don't put ourselves in the opposite person's shoes, in this case, the receiver of the message should be understood properly. We should be aware of their situation. We should appreciate their point of view. If we don't have that, then we suffer from lack of empathy, which can be a serious psychological barrier. How do we overcome these psychological barriers? We need to pay attention to our ability to listen, actively listen, and not make evaluations as we listen. We need to be patient. We also have to be humble and appreciate the other person's perspective. We also create, as a leader of a group or a team or a department, we need to create a supportive environment. And of course, that kind of emotional awareness and intelligence can only help overcome some of these psychological barriers. It can be language and cultural barriers that we call as linguistic and cultural barriers. Now, when I travel to a country where I'm not familiar with that particular language, I'm going to have a hard time trying to communicate even simple stuff. Or going and shopping in the local markets can be a pretty much a challenge. So, the lack of understanding of a particular language, jargon, or vocabulary can be a serious, linguistic barrier. Cultural differences, we all appreciate that we come from different cultural backgrounds. And if we do not train ourselves to appreciate different cultures and be aware of cultural differences, the way we talk, the choice of words, the way we encode our message can create differences and can hurt other people's feelings. That is because we do not have enough awareness of cultures, which we should. Misinterpretation of nonverbal cues and gestures across cultures. Gestures in different countries have different connotations and meaning. So we got to be aware of how body movements, gestures have the kind of impact they have in certain cultures. And they could be possibly misinterpreted by cultures, different cultures that are completely different from ours. How do we have strategies to mitigate these? We should go through some language training, especially if you're going for an expatriate assignment, work assignment, say in Germany. Understanding German would be really helpful. If I'm going working in, say, India or China, understanding a bit of language, some kind of language training can only help. Also, the same applies to cultures. So cultures in Brazil and cultures in, say, Indonesia, or culture in Middle East, or cultures in America are pretty much different. And we got to be aware and appreciate that diversity. Any kind of cultural, awareness training can only help mitigate some of these linguistic and cultural barriers. Moving on. So we do have also organizational barriers. Structures in organizations, they get very complex as organizations grow in size, the number of products that they offer, and the number of locations that they serve. Structures can become very, very complex, meaning you have to take a lot of time communicating upward. And also the same applies to getting instructions, understanding the vision and mission of the organization, having that cascading of goals from being organizational goals, team goals, group goals, and individual goals. So that can become a hassle because organizations have overgrown, and communication then becomes even tougher. Lack of transparency, poor communication channels within the organization. I think you all know this from experience. Communicating across organizations is always a challenge. Sometimes it's better off when you go face to face and talk to people so that they empathize and understand your perspective. Sometimes emails might be, more efficient because you're trying to communicate something simple, something urgent, and something very specific that can be attached as a document. So obviously making sure you focus on transparency, have strong communication channels, have a backup, do some clarification on communication networks, which can only help remove and mitigate some of these organizational barriers. So open door policies, strong leadership, good team building, breaking the silos, working on a collaborative culture, and making sure we have effective communication systems are all good methods of overcoming organizational barriers. So that, in summary, is the list of categories of communication barriers and some of the good strategies that you can use both at the personal level and the organizational level to overcome these barriers. Thank you.